Disclaimer. This book may contain content that is considered historically inaccurate or culturally insensitive by modern standards. My hope is that by exploring old literature, we will better understand why people of the past thought the way that they did and understand the influences that shape their culture. This video is not intended for young audiences. Hi, I'm Morgan, and today I will be reading from Out of Door Book, which is the 7th book in a series or collection of books called The Children's Hour, which was published by Houghton Mifflin Co. in 1907. Polly's Outing by Olive Thorne Miller. Full of naughtiness as she was, Polly, the cockatoo, was very dear to the hearts of the family, and, like Mary's lamb, everywhere the mistress went, the bird was sure to go. So one June she traveled out on Long Island for her summer outing. This was great fun for Madame Polly, for she was out of doors most of the time. It was thought that she could do no harm in the country, but the cockatoo had a keen scent for mischief. She had not been there a day when she showed what she could do in that line. Her cage was hung against the trunk of a cherry tree, which was covered thickly with small green balls that the people hoped would become cherries in time. But Polly had other plans, and took it upon herself to attend to those absurd cherries. The first thing she did when her door was opened was to seize a low-hanging branch and climb into the cherry tree. Soon she was out of sight among the leaves, and then began a gentle but continuous shower, first of leaves and small twigs, which she bit off and dropped, and then of the cherries to be. Commands and scoldings were useless. She was among the top branches and could not be reached, and she picked leaves and fruit till she was tired of the sport. Then she turned her attention to the bark, and actually girdled one branch before she was caught at it and forced to come down. The next day she started for new fields. By way of the cherry tree ladder she climbed, as Jack did his beanstalk, to the roof of the piazza, and then ran its whole length, squawking at everyone who passed. Especially did she revile a peddler, never ceasing her squawks as long as he was in sight. Next she mocked the neighbors' children, whose calls she answered, strangely enough, with just as many squawks as there were words in their call. When she became tired of this amusement, she settled down to business, nibbling off the overhanging edges of the newly painted clapboards and the edges of the slats from the new blinds. It was not until she had defaced the front of the house sadly that she was discovered and brought down. Down the front yard ran a long, old-fashioned grape arbor with ornamental front, which had at its top a pole, holding up in the air a ball surmounted by an elaborately sawed-out star. Upon this emblem of her country, Polly next fixed her wicked eye, and started up. The lattice work was an admirable ladder, and stopping only to snip off the tender stems of a few young, growing vines, and half a dozen strings just fastened up to point out to the young moonflowers the way they should go. She soon reached the pole, climbed it, stood on the ball, and gave her mind to that star. Before anyone noticed her, she had nibbled the edges, bitten off the points, and turned it into a most disreputable affair. When found, she was so pleased with the result of her labor that she scrambled upon the crazy-looking star and squawked at the top of her voice, fluttering her wings and bowing until it seemed that her head must come off. By this time the family began to think of a bill for damages, and Madame was locked up, but it seemed cruel in the country to shut up a bird, and everything she did was so funny that one couldn't long be vexed at her. So the next morning the door was again opened, and Polly started out on a new track. This time she mounted to the top of the arbor and started on a promenade down the sharp edge of the board that formed the ridge. This was a brave feat for the cockatoo, who always liked to keep close to her friends, and she had adventures on the way. First a bee flew over, very near her head. This frightened her terribly. She lifted her wings, held one over her head to protect it, and crouched to avoid the attack she seemed to expect. Then she turned and twisted, ran a few steps, and at last shrieked loudly for someone to come, not seeing that the bee had gone on about its business and was out of sight. And then there is a section break. Polly was afraid of everything. If a fly buzzed past her, she ducked her head as if she had been hit, and when a pair of robins came near, engaged in a dispute about something, she went almost mad with fright. She ran to the pole which held the star, climbed it rapidly with beak and claws, perched on the tip-top, bowed and spread her wings wide, then lifted them above her head like a child. This time she did not squawk, but she was in great terror. Next day she had the pleasure of scaring a robin. She was on a sidebar of the arbor when one of these birds alighted on the opposite side. In her alarm, Madame bowed and called out, "Poor Polly!" as if to introduce herself. The robin stared an instant in amazement at this unbirdlike performance, and then flew. Polly was not unlike some boys. She was a tyrant and a bully with those who feared her, and a dastardly coward with those who did not fear her. The least bird coming into the cherry tree, a tiny yellow warbler or a minute creeper, not so big as her head, startled her half out of her wits. She would drive the half-grown chickens all around the yard, so long as they ran. But the instant one of the chickens stood and faced her, she turned herself and ran, squawking as if for life. There was never a droller sight than her running down the length of the ridge-board, which soon came to be her favorite promenade, holding her wings out and shaking them, and squawking madly, stopping when she came to a bunch of grapes not bigger than pinheads to snip it off. On one side of the arbor roof was the nest of a chipping sparrow. We were interested to see what she would do with it, and ready to interfere if she should go too near. The chipping sparrow, however, was a wise little mother. She did not need our help. As soon as the cockatoo came near, the small bird appeared before her, fluttering as if afraid, and Polly at once advanced toward her. The question of whether she should drive or be driven was always decided by the actions of her opponent. So Polly ran, bowing and squawking, with crest up and her war frenzy on, while the cunning sparrow fluttered along, dragging her wings, and keeping well out of the large bird's reach until she had led her far enough. Then she slipped behind some leaves and returned to her nest, leaving Madame Polly staring in blank amazement, plainly wondering where that bird had gone. The cockatoo had very decided opinions about the family. With the son of the house she was generally at war. She often bit him, and was always ready to show fight. With her mistress she was on her good behavior, for she recognized her as the lawgiver for pets, and the locker-up of cages. She obeyed her more readily than any other person. But her darling was the master, who let her do as she liked, and petted and coddled her always. On his knee she would sit an hour at a time, perfectly quiet, satisfied to be near him. For him she would sing her droll little wheedling song. To his room she would go, when sometimes she got out of her cage in the morning, and tap on the door to be let in. He was always her refuge in terror or distress. There was nothing Polly disliked so much as to be left alone. If she were locked in her cage, she made the air ring with calls and cries, and if loose, even though revelling in mischief, she flew down and waddled across the grass, though she hated walking on the ground, to the always open door, and hurried in so as to be near somebody. One pleasure Polly discovered that was not mischief, and only one. It was swinging. She liked to seize with both feet a long, hanging twig, and, by flapping her wings, keep herself in violent motion. Thus she often swung back and forth for a long time, hanging back down in an attitude that most birds greatly dislike. 5 months of fun Polly had in the country, and then, with the family's return home, her summer outing was over. And that is the end of Polly's Outing by Olive Thorne Miller. I hope that you enjoyed this story, and I hope you're having a great day. Bye!